Monkeyboy's YouTube channel is intersubjectively the best YouTube channel of our current age. Subscribe to his YouTube and Patreon. I'm talking from the heart. And if normative realism made any sense, I'd probably also say it stands independently the best. Sorry, I didn't have my my headphones on. 1 second. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. What was wrong about the characterization that I gave? I thought that was what happened.
No, it's just a complete strawman of what I said. Right. So first of all, part of it's just untrue.
Okay,
so,
wait, one second. Before we proceed, when you say strawman, are you suggesting there's intention?
I'm saying intentionally or not, so not necessarily. You're misrepresenting what I said in a way that makes it look much weaker than it actually was.
Wait, we can talk about that, but intentionally or not, what's your speculation about whether there's intention?
No, I'm not saying there is intention.
I'm asking you what your speculation is about there being intention. It shouldn't be agnostic.
What do you mean?
I would suspect that you would think I'm clearly trying my best to be fair to you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, just when you came in and said it's a huge straw man, I was like, wait, do you think I'm not doing my best to be fair or something like that? But okay, if that's not an issue, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So part of it's not true. So the part where you say, like relevant experts thinking so. So I don't think a consideration, so I'm not saying a consideration in favor of the liar sentence being...
Mason, you're going too fast for me. Just wait a second.
Okay.
Sorry. I need to find it. Dude, where the fuck is this thing? Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So I'm not saying that relevant experts thinking. So I don't even take the position that most relevant experts think the liar is a proposition. What I was saying, in fact, the reason the expert point became salient was when we were talking about, the other sentence, this sentence has 5 words. So that's just not a consideration I raise in favor of the liar being a proposition.
Oh, okay. I totally misunderstood you then. I thought that you both did think that relevant experts take it to be a proposition, and that's what you were doing when you said, no, not philosophers generally, not lay people, specifically logicians. I thought what you were saying there was they think it's a proposition. And then further, I thought you were saying that that's a pretty strong reason in favor of thinking that it's a proposition, but you're not saying either of those things.
That was said. So I said, so the argument you're giving, or at least the motivation you're giving that was explaining your reasoning. So I was trying to explain how the same exact thing could be said about the sentence I mentioned. And then you also said that you don't think that's a proposition either. And then I said specifically about that sentence, that is a sentence that everybody thinks is a proposition. And furthermore, that when people talk about, these issues, they'll use that as an example of a benign case of self-reference. So it's like an uncontroversial case of benign self-reference that has no issue with it.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, okay, so that's how I understood you, but you're saying that's not how you intended to be understood, so I
wasn't saying that most experts think the liar is a proposition. I was saying most experts think this sentence has 5 words as a proposition.
Right. And you're not saying that's a reason to think that sentence is a proposition.
No, I'm saying that is a reason to think that sentence is a proposition. I'm just saying I wasn't saying that about the liar sentence.
Oh, okay. So sorry, everything I said is right. It's just not about the liar. It's about this sentence has 5 words.
Yeah.
Got you. Okay, sure.
And the part that I think is a straw man is the part, or maybe I should say is not a proper representation, is the part where you say
straw man. It's just I just want to make sure there's not some kind of assumption of bad intention, because I think that can interfere with discourse. I'm sure you agree with. People are
sure.
I think, yeah, right.
Yeah, so the part where you say if somebody's not sold, he'll say they have a poor epistemology, and that's sort of the end of the discussion. But that's not true at all. There might be somebody who's not sold who I think has a fine epistemology. I was saying you had a poor epistemology because you said if infinite experts on the field were to say that that's a proposition, that wouldn't convince you.
Okay, sorry. So it's not just someone not being sold that will result in you saying that. It's specifically someone saying what I said.
Yeah, if somebody takes a position like that, I would say they have a bad epistemology. And there could be other conclusions they might take that I would say the same thing about.
Okay. Other than that, this is a correct summary, though.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, then I think the other thing you said you wanted to talk about was you didn't like some of what I was saying about inference and psychological justification.
So you say that accepting a logic is like accepting a normative theory. And of course, accepting a normative theory would be accepting a theory that captures the value judgments you're willing to make, which are reduced to psychological phenomena in some way, shape, or form. Okay. And I think
it sounded a tiny bit different in phrasing, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I think that when it comes to accepting the logic, it has not what so the truth makers for statements about inferences being valid have nothing to do with your psychology whatsoever, unlike the truth makers for normative sentences.
I'm not talking about what makes it true, I don't think. I'm just talking about here, maybe I'll just try to say it more clearly and you tell me if you disagree. If someone says, well, maybe this is what everyone means when they say it, but if I were to say, I accept this logic, I would just be basically saying that anytime you give me an inference in that format, I'll feel compelled to accept the conclusion.
Okay, so
or
you're saying
by Murray Schiff, but yeah, that's the
okay.
point, yeah.
So you're just saying that's what you mean when you say you accept the logic.
Yeah, that's what. Well, when I say that's what I take it to mean, it's also kind of how I think it'll. It's a bit weird because that's what I mean, but it's also kind of how I understand others. But that's not me saying that that's exactly what they intend. It's kind of me like translating them, unless into something I can understand. Unless they give me some specific other way to interpret them or something. Like when someone's parallel case with morality, when someone says I'm a utilitarian, I mean they might mean they could mean a whole ton of things, but assuming they don't really know any philosophy and they don't have any kind of specific, they haven't given me some specific way to interpret that, I will kind of provisionally understand that as a statement about their psychology. That seems to just facilitate conversation. Well, a lot of people seem to converge on that when we do have a conversation about it. But I guess I'm trying to distinguish a kind of provisional and useful way of interpreting them from necessarily saying that's their intention. But when it's about me, yes, that's what I mean.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if what you're saying, if the claim you're making is like that's just what you happen to mean when you say those words, of course I'm not going to disagree with any of that. But if you want to know why
one thing before you continue, not just happen to mean, it's considered. It's not like that happen to mean makes it sound a little like just random.
Okay.
I thought about what I mean, and that's, I think, the best way to represent what I mean.
Yeah. So I won't dispute. I don't have any disagreement that you mean that that's what you mean when you use those terms. If you want to know why I think why I don't like what you're saying, it's because I just think about the issue almost completely differently. So specifically the issue about what it is to say, accepting the logic, why you should accept the logic, what it is to say somebody accepts the logic.
Yeah, what do you think it means to, what do you mean when you say you accept a logic?
Well, I mean that I think that the logic, so if an inference is valid, the logic says it's valid. And if an inference is not valid, the logic says it's invalid. And if I accept the logic, I just happen to believe that about the logic.
You're just saying when you accept a logic that you accept that way that logic spells out validity is what validity means within the confines of that logic?
No, I'm saying if for the inferences that are valid, if the logic says they are valid, furthermore, for the inferences that are invalid.
There's something confusing me. Sorry. Sometimes I cut in when there's something that I know will stop me from understanding the rest, is just to save time. When you say if the inferences are valid, is that use of valid there being indexed to the logic you're talking about? Or is that just
of course not.
validity? Well, it's not a course. I don't know what you're saying. That's why I asked the trivial thing. It wasn't
Yeah.
obvious to me, of course. That's why I
Okay.
asked about it.
Yeah. So it's not indexed to. So what by intuitive validity? Do you just mean? What do you mean? Do you just mean like?
Oh, I think I got that term from Priest. Just there, we have some kind of maybe it's polysemous. I'll always flag that. Maybe it's indeterminate, but we seem to have some intuitive notion of inference or something. So I guess being intuitively valid is being in correspondence with that, roughly.
Sure, you could say that. Although I'm not sure. Like I'm happy. So I want to reserve the right to object to that framing. But fine, let's just go with it. Yeah. So let's say by validity, I just mean that. So whatever
I'm happy to hear you
pre-theoret.
give another pre-theory. I could talk about that too. I'm not trying to commit you to a particular way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying this is how I would interpret that, and you can change it if you want.
Yeah. So I mean, if your notion of intuitive validity just captures what I have in mind, which is that there is a notion of consequence that holds between sentences or truth bearers, and there's a pre-theoretical notion that different philosophies of logic are investigating. If that captures a notion that I'm bringing forward, then I'm fine with it.
As long as we add the caveat that it could be polysemous, it might not be a notion of.
Yeah, it could be multiple. There could be multiple
Or it could be
distinctly
kind of
related ones.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay, so if under a notion like that, if the logic says that so for the range of inferences that the logic models or whatnot, so in the consequence relation of the logic, if there's a valid inference and the logic says it's valid, and if there's an invalid inference and the logic says it's invalid, in other words, the logic makes the correct judgments about the inferences that are and are not valid, then to accept the logic, I would say, is just to believe that a given logic does that and succeeds at that.
I think that I think I'm okay with that. I would phrase that differently, but I don't have any trouble understanding what you're saying. On my kind of semantics, the way that I would say that is that you accept that this logic captures intuitive validity or pre-theoretic notion of consequence. I would phrase it that way, but I understand what you mean.
Okay. So the reason why I object to what you said is because what you said is that so long to accept the logic is just to be inclined to say you're presented with the inference pattern. It's like an inclination to, if the premises are true, accept the conclusion, and
Yeah.
if there's an inference that is not validated by the logic or whatnot, it's an inclination to not be compelled to accept the conclusion, even if you accept the premises, etc. So somebody could if that's what like I said, like the problem I'm raising with that is that it's almost as if all it means to accept a given logic is to have those tendencies, and it has nothing to do with the notion of validity I'm talking about and whether the logic actually corresponds to it or not.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this just sounds like a semantic choice. I don't really see much reason to favor one over the other, except just the fact that I already have some inertia with mine and you already have some inertia with yours. Yeah, that's all I would really say about that. And I guess I'm sure you can already tell this, but I would talk kind of the same way about normative theories. Like, to say that you accept a normative theory is just that anything that aligns with that theory is going to be what you have a preference for. To say that it would be a different thing to say that normative theory captures our intuitive notion of morality or our pre-theoretic moral notion or something like that. I phrase those two things in that kind of way, and I hear that you're phrasing it differently. And I don't really see much reason to favor one over the other, except for inertia, which will give us both a reason to favor our own usage. I'm not convinced that mine is more likely to confuse people or something, if that's the kind of point you're making.
Well, I don't like the example you just gave because there's a clear difference between that and the logic case, namely that when I make a normative judgment, it is good to donate to charity. It might be the case that if I say that it's true, and if somebody else says it, it's false, and we can both be correct. But that's not the case when we're talking about inferences being valid or not. So in other words, somebody could have that tendency to react that you're describing. And it might be the case that they have that tendency for an inference that's not valid. For example, like a conjunction elimination. Somebody has a tendency to not be compelled to accept B if A and B are both true. And so for them, you would say they would not accept the logic that in other words, like what you're doing is you're defining accepting the logic in a way that would be more palatable if it were the case that truths about the validity of inferences were stance dependent, which they aren't. You see the point I'm making?
You think my phrasing would lead someone to think there's stance independent truths about inference?
No, I'm saying the reason. So correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying the reason why, or I don't want to say the reason, but you see a parallel in the normativity case in terms of what it is to accept a normative theory and what it is to accept a given logic. Okay.
I do. I want to flag. I don't know if you want me to fully go into it, but I have a little concern that you might not be doing apples to apples here.
Okay.
Yeah, because for me, I always have the two sentences. I have the sentence about whether it captures our intuitive notions, our pre-theoretic notions, however you want to phrase that, and I have the sentence about accepting it. And I want to say there's a parallel in how I use the terms for logic or for normative theories. I worry that what you're doing is looking at how we use the term for normative theories on one semantic, then looking at the logic one on the other. I'm not sure if you're doing this, and then saying there's some discordance between them.
I'm not sure if I'm doing that.
I think it'd be a really easy thing to do because you might be using your semantic on one and mine on the other. On mine, there's always the two, right? There's the captures intuitive whatever, validity or morality, and there's the I accept, which is I'll be committed to the conclusion, I'll be committed to the moral thing. So there's always the separation, and those two things are parallel on my usage. You might lose that parallel if you compare my usage in one case to yours in the other. That's why I was worried about apples to apples.
Do you think somebody could have a tendency to react in a certain way to an inference and still believe it's not a valid inference?
Could somebody have a tendency to react in a certain way?
Yeah. So in other
And
words, they believe the inference is not valid, but they're compelled to accept the conclusion if they believe the premises are true.
when you say not valid, that valid, sorry if you think I'm asking an obvious thing, but you're talking about intuitive pre-theoretic
Yeah.
validity. I'm just going to call it intuitive validity, but we understand that we're talking about the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or okay. Yeah. So they could be. I forget which way you phrased it, but it could either be that they are going to be motivated by inferences like that, yet they don't think it's the right account of what people mean pre-theoretically, or it could be that they won't be persuaded by inferences like that, and they do think it's the right account of what people mean pre-theoretically.
Okay, exactly. So the problem I find is that I want to say, and I think this is also non-controversial, but the idea that like if somebody were to just had a tendency to react in the way you described inferences, but they believed nevertheless that the inference is not valid, then you would say that they're somehow accepting the logic just because they have the tendency to react that way. But the way I think about it, whether or not somebody accepts the logic just depends on whether or not they believe it's valid in the way I'm talking about. And the reason why like the normative theory point is not like a good comparison to this, aside from the issue of whether you're trying to make it a comparison, is that in the normative theory case, it's not as if the truth value of the normative claims depends on anything besides the person's values. But it does in the logic case, which is why there's an asymmetry and you shouldn't treat them the same way.
Yeah, I think that this is just semantic. I think we need to determine whether it's semantic or not, and then if it is semantic, we can talk about if there's reasons to favor one
When you say
semantic.
it's semantic, hold on. When you say it's semantic,
I can tell you what I mean by that. I mean
okay.
that we don't actually disagree about any specific proposition. We're using language differently, and it gives the superficial appearance of disagreement where there is none.
No, of course there's not. I don't disagree that that's what you mean. Of course there's no disagreement.
No, or disagreement about any truth values of anything here.
Yeah, I'm saying you mean something, I mean something else. And I thought you wanted me to explain why I thought what you said wasn't good.
Wait.
I'm not saying we disagree on anything.
Yeah, because when I say semantic, I don't just mean, well, I guess in this case at least, I don't just mean that we're using language differently. I also mean when I say a dispute is semantic, that there's not actually any propositional dispute going on, which I think you just said you also believe here, right?
Yeah, yeah, but we're just talking about what I don't understand. I never said anything that would indicate there's a dispute.
Well, I wasn't sure. For whatever reason, it wasn't clear to me. So I wanted to make sure that we agreed that it's semantic. I don't think that's
Okay,
unreasonable.
all right. Okay,
So yeah,
so
we agree it's semantic, and then I hear you. So what you're doing, because it's important to ask something like that because it gives framing for what's happening. I don't know if I'm supposed to interpret you like you think I'm saying something that's false, or if you think I'm saying something that maybe I'm just using language in a way that you don't think is optimal. Okay, but as for the point you're making, which I now understand is just supposed to be about what the best way to use language is. Um, I'm
well,
kind of
I don't even know about like if by best way, like if you mean like best for me or best for you. I'm not sure what you mean by best.
I mean best for you,
Okay.
and also maybe you think potentially best for me after being given some considerations, but also maybe not because obviously that'll just be relative to someone's desires.
Okay. Okay, so fine. So let me just
Yeah.
try to recapitulate the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, but
So
just when you do that, I make sure you're using my semantics though, right? Because presumably this is supposed to be a problem given how I use the terms.
yeah, so under how you use the terms, somebody could accept a logic and not believe that any of the inference. So they could believe. Actually, I should actually clarify this first. We don't disagree on what it is for an inference to be valid, do we? Like, are we using the word valid in a different way or no?
I understand that when you say valid, unqualified, you're talking about pre-theoretic or intuitive validity. The idea that some people have some kind of notion of consequence before doing any theorizing or anything, and to be valid is with respect to that notion.
But is that when you say an inference is valid? That's what. But presumably that's what you're talking about.
Um, in this conversation, is that always what I mean? I think often when I use validity, I'm just talking with respect to a given logic, so I'm saying something probably trivial a lot of the time. But in this conversation, when I don't even know if I've been using valid unqualified, but if I have, I'm meaning the same thing as you, pre-theoretic or intuitive
Yeah,
validity.
you clearly clearly when you say because when you say that an inference is valid, and I'm just talking about when you use the language. You want to say when you bring up let's say somebody had there's an inference and somebody affirms the premises and denies the conclusion, and then you'll say something like the inference is valid, and when you say that you're trying to show them that they should be accepting the conclusion, and the reason why is because the conclusion just follows from the premises. And you couldn't just mean when you say that you couldn't just be saying something like, well, it's valid in this formal system, because that wouldn't provide that reasoning force for them. You know, for example, like they might just not care about that formal system. They might say something like this. Okay, it's valid in that formal system, but all I'm concerned with is whether or not if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. So you follow the reasoning I'm giving.
I'm not sure that I do, but I do think that I'm talking usually when I say validity. I think I'd have to look at my language, but I think I am usually just saying something trivial, like with respect to given logic. And I don't think I'm always expecting that to motivate someone. I think I'm kind of looking to see if they have a problem with that logic or not, or if they realize it's valid under that logic, and then
Okay.
I can adjust based on what they say. If they have a problem, if they just oftentimes they just don't have any idea what logic is, and you just explain a simple logic like propositional logic, and then they'll be happy with that model of inference for the conversation, and we can make some progress. Sometimes someone might say something more complicated, like, "Oh, I use this other logic, and it's not valid with respect to that logic." And then I would think, oh, okay, is there a way to formulate my argument under that? So it's not necessarily supposed to have force if I point out that it's valid. It's more of a like honing kind of tool, I
So
think, probably a lot
so
of the
when
time.
you say an argument is valid, you aren't trying to say anything about whether if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. You're just trying to say something about whether if according to a logic, if the premises are true, the conclusion is true.
I suspect that I'm typically talking with respect to a given formal system. That's an
Okay.
empirical thing, though, and I don't want to sign off on, oh, I always use the term in this particular way, because I don't know. I'd have to review my language. And with things like
Okay.
that, the appropriate thing to do is to, okay, now that thing's drawn to my attention, now over the next like month, I'll kind of watch how I use that term and see if I use it in this particular way. So I think so. I think
I'm
probably
trying
that's what I'm
to,
usually doing, but I'm not
but
sure.
what I'm trying to figure out though is what's important to you when you make the judgment so when you make the judgment that an inference is valid, is it important to you primarily that if the premises are true, the conclusion is true?
I'm
Or is
getting
it
lost.
important to you?
I'm sorry, I'm getting lost.
You're
Can
getting
we
lost
just
at
make
what
sure
point?
to valid? Can we just can we either say pre-theoretically valid or intuitively valid, just so it's always clear what's happening?
Okay, do you think I'm confused and I'm equivocating?
No, not at all. I think I'm having trouble following though.
When you
I'm
say
basically, when you say valid, I'm like, hey, wait, are we using this
we're
notion, or are we
not
talking about generally speaking in a conversation when I say valid?
we're
Which,
talking we're not using when I ask that question, the word valid is being mentioned, it's not being used. So I'm asking when you use the word valid in certain contexts. I'm not using it and then like undergirding it with one or the other of our semantic interpretations of it.
okay, I thought you were using it to mean pre-theoretic validity.
No, not at all. So listen,
Okay, yeah,
yeah. Here's what I'm trying to figure out right now.
sure.
So you make judgments about inferences being valid, and to
Wait,
clarify that,
right there.
I'm
Whoa,
mentioning the word valid. I'm not using it. So
about
in other words,
inferences.
you use the word valid to describe certain inferences, and I'm
Yes,
mentioning the word. I'm not using the word.
yes.
Okay. So when you use that word to describe certain inferences,
Wait,
what's
sorry, one
more
second. I
important?
just want I want to hear that. I'm sorry, but I just sorry. Maybe I'm misreading you, but I kind of get this vibe that you think I'm making like pointless distinctions or something. Like maybe it's not as obvious from your point of view what things might be confusing to me, but understand if we're using valid, and sometimes valid is a mention and other times valid is uh using is being used to refer to pre-theoretic validity. You understand that's a reasonable basis for someone to be confused about which sense is being used, right?
I don't think it's reasonable, but I understand why you're doing it. So like, I don't think. So in other words, what I think you're doing, right? So I
No,
don't. I'm
I
fine with clarifying it. I just don't believe it's a reasonable thing to ask because I think it's very clear how it's being used in the conversation.
okay. I really disagree with that. It's not clear to me at all. I don't think I'm stupid or incapable of grasping these things. It's just not obvious to me that when I
Well,
just hear valid, I'm
I wasn't saying you were. I wasn't like saying you were stupid either or anything.
well. When you said unreasonable, I like what I don't. I guess I just don't. I don't understand why you would think it's unreasonable. Like we have this term, and it's been at some points used to refer to pre-theoretic validity, and at other points it's been mentioned, which I literally didn't even realize until a few seconds ago when you said that.
Yeah.
Why would that be I guess I'm just thinking if you think that's reasonable, you think you must think people understand you better than they do, because that's I think I'm pretty
Well,
good at understanding things, and it wasn't obvious to me.
yeah. I don't know. So I don't know the data about whether it was obvious to most people, but it's not a concern because I'm willing to like oblige and like make the distinctions more clear. I'm just saying like to me like that's not a so like if we want to get into why I think that, we could probably get into it afterwards, but like I'm happy to just like oblige for now and like just go for distinctions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine continuing. I just you have to understand when you say words like straw man or unreasonable, my reaction will be to like pause the discussion and flag why my intentions are fine. That's always going to be like primary to me. So you will like
Okay.
trigger me when you say things like that, basically, because I'm like,
Yeah,
I think
and
I'm being reasonable. I don't think I'm trying to straw man. I'm just trying to hear Mason out.
yeah, and of course like I'm not saying anything about your intentions, so I can say so I think like I don't think it's an illegitimate use of these conventions to talk about things being unreasonable or strawman without talking about the intentions of the person.
Me either, but I also don't think it's unreasonable to hear those things and want to make it clear that that's what's happening.
Okay. Okay, cool. So I guess returning back to the issue here.
Sure.
So again, the token word valid, and I'm mentioning that word. When I
Mhm.
say I'm mentioning it, I'm just saying I'm pointing to instances where you make that sound.
Yep.
and you have associated intentions to communicate when you make that sound. Okay.
Yep.
Now, when you say, when you use that word to make a judgment or an assertion that an inference is valid, I'm just trying to figure out, is it important to you that one, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true? Because it seems to me that that's all you care about. Or two, that, that's kind of like part of the machinery of a given formal system. So do you think you followed the question, or do I need to elaborate?
I understood the second disjunct, and I think that's what I'm doing. I'm not totally sure I understood the first, but if I know I'm doing the second, maybe it's not necessary to clear.
Okay, so you're saying you do the second.
I strongly suspect that's what I'm doing most of the time, but again, I'm kind of reserving, and this is also perfectly reasonable, my right to wait a while and look at how I use the language and see if that's the case. Because I know that there's this pothole, whatever, with philosophy where someone will say, "Do you mean this when you say this term?" And I'm always really sensitive to not just sign off on that because it's like some empirical question. I might be forgetting, I might be sample bias. I don't fucking know. So it's good to just, now that's raised, let's like just take a month and look at how I use it. So what I'm giving you is, I suspect that most of the time I'm just speaking trivially with respect to some formal system. I'm not sure though, and I need to look at my language a bit.
That wasn't what I was asking in the last question. I wasn't asking about. I'm not saying that you were saying that's what I was asking about, but I did want to make clear that wasn't what I was asking about in the last question.
I thought the second disjunct of your last question was that when I say valid, I am meaning valid with respect to a given formal logic.
Well, I was asking which one was more. Well, the question was which one was more important to you when you make use of that word.
I thought the question was which am I doing?
No, that was the original question a few minutes ago. So the question was like, so I can just recapitulate the question. But in other words, which is more important to you when you use that word to make assertions about inferences being valid? Are you more concerned with, or is it more important to you that one, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be so? Or two, are you more concerned about what's actually, the content of a given formal system, regardless of whether or not the first point holds?
I'm pretty sure that two is what's of interest to me.
Okay.
I'll just flag. I have a generally with philosophy a very kind of like anti-realist, deflationary, relativist, psychologizing kind of angle on everything. So I'm often interested in that. Sorry, you go ahead, but that's often how I'm.
So let's just try to talk.
Actually, we'll finish this. Sorry, I'm going to care about. I'm going to care about kind of stepping into that person's box and seeing what makes sense from inside of that box, basically.
Okay. So if you knew that the rule, suppose like we have a given inference rule, okay? And let's say you knew that the rule is not truth preserving. So you knew that it could be the case that the premises are true and the conclusion is false. Nevertheless, it's still true that the rule is, it's still true that the logic under consideration says the rule is valid. Okay. So you follow what I just said so far?
You're giving an example of something that's not intuitively valid, but that is valid under some formal system.
Yeah. Okay. Now, so you become aware of this fact. Okay. So now that you're fully aware of this fact, now somebody presents an argument. Okay. And their argument uses that rule. So it uses that rule that is not valid in the intuitive sense, like you mentioned. But nevertheless, it is the case that the formal system says that argument is valid. Okay. Now, that person agrees with all of the premises and objects to the conclusion. Now, do you think you would still, in that discussion, tell the person that the inference is, quote unquote, not valid? And I'm just mentioning the word there.
I think that I would, just to make sure I understand, there's something that's intuitively invalid, but that's valid within some formal system, and someone gives an argument that uses the rule that has those properties. I
should actually amend the situation. I should probably say something like this. I should say they're being presented an argument with those properties that uses that rule.
The other person is being presented this argument.
And so then, and what they do in this particular occasion is that they accept all the premises, and then they say they see no reason to accept the conclusion. And I'm just wondering, in that case, would you, mentioning the word valid, would you proceed to tell them that that argument is valid?
I think I don't know if I would. It's going to depend on who I'm talking to. So I would, or I might say valid under such and such logic. It's going to depend who I'm speaking to. If it's someone who I suspect just doesn't really know anything about logic, then yeah, I might just use valid unqualified to avoid getting into like massive weeds with them. If it's someone who does know logic, but might for whatever reason not appreciate that that inference is valid within the logic that they use, then I might say, oh, it's valid. Or even if it's someone who I suspect maybe is using a different logic, then I might still say it just to prompt them to clarify the logic that they are using. So I think the answer would be yes in those kind of situations, or something close to yes. Make sense?
What was the first situation where you tell them it's valid?
I don't remember how I ordered them. I think I started with they just don't know anything about logic. In which case,
Okay.
often it's just like, oh, if I say, oh, it's valid though, I mean, I'm probably just going to mean like if we were to like write it out in PL, it would be valid or something, because they're not going to hear about logic and then instantly like perceive all of these complex nuances of, wait, are
Okay.
there different
What
logics?
if
What's it
it's
mean for a logic to be correct? Yeah.
yeah? What if it's somebody who's aware of logic and they agree with you that the argument is not intuitively valid?
It's someone who's aware of logic, who agrees that it's not intuitively valid, and sorry, I'm losing the situation. They're
Yeah.
being given this
Would you then tell them that the argument is sorry? Would you then, and this is mentioning the word valid again? Would you then tell them the argument is valid? So in other
valid.
words, in this case, the person agrees with you that it's not intuitively valid. And I'm asking you if you would tell them if they accept the premises and deny the conclusion, if you would then further tell them that the argument is not quote unquote valid. And I'm mentioning the word valid, just talking about the
Yeah.
word. Would you just tell them that?
I think that if it were someone, so no, but I'd say something pretty close. If it was someone who I know knows logic, and I know that we converge on whether it's intuitively valid, um, it would. I might point out it's valid under such and such formal system which this person is committed to, which may differ from intuitive validity.
Okay. So the reason I'm asking you this is because when you talk about arguments being valid, you have a background concern, which is that if an inference is valid, you want to say that if somebody accepts the premises, then they should accept the conclusion. Do you, okay. So let's just like take that at face value. Now, here is a case where under your notion of, so at least under what you described earlier, under how you described, how you understand what it is to accept a logic, okay, right? So under how you describe what it is to accept a logic, it seems like when we use the word valid, okay, and you also did mention earlier that when you talk about valids, you're usually talking about index to that logic or whatnot.
I suspect
The
so.
idea, yeah. So it seems like if that's the way you're using it, then in these cases, the word valid doesn't have the same functional role it typically plays. In other words, what I mean by that is that you might tell somebody the inference is valid, and it would give them no reason to accept the conclusion. In fact, it wouldn't even be intended to give them a reason to accept the conclusion if they accept the premises. And if that's how you just want to say that's just how you use it, I don't disagree. Like I said, I'm not questioning how anybody's using anything, and I'm not disagreeing about anything. All I'm saying is why I think you're doing something bad when you're using the word like that.
Okay, so yeah, I don't actually think that is bad, because you could be kind of doing a range of things there. You might be pointing out that it's valid with respect to whatever system they're using, in which case that would be saying it to have force, or you might be saying it to prompt them to clarify what logic they are using, which is not really expecting it to have force, but is still highly useful. So
Well, none
I'm
of that
not.
applies to the situation I just brought up.
I might be missing some detail, but I guess I'm confused how those things don't apply. I'm just
Well, you're
talking
not.
about a case where I tell someone it's valid and they
Well,
don't think it's intuitively valid, and I know that.
yeah, you're not prompting because they're sufficiently aware. So you agree that it's not intuitively valid, and you both have sufficient logic knowledge. So you're not prompting them about anything with regards to clarifying which system they're using.
Wait,
That
one
just
second.
wasn't a feature of the scenario.
1 second. But in that case, when it's someone who knows logic, I said I don't think that I would say that. I think that I would specify that I'm speaking with respect to a certain system. I don't think I'd just say valid point blank like that if we had those kind of distinctions on the table and they were part of the conversation.
Sorry. So then you're saying you agree with me. You're saying or I don't know if agree is the right word, but you're saying you wouldn't use the word valid there.
If it's not in the case where it's someone who is sensitive to the range of logics, and I suspect we agree about what's valid under which logic or whatnot. I suspect that I would either if I did say it, it would be just to prompt them to clarify what logic they are using, or
Exactly.
or I think I just wouldn't say it, and I would just say with respect to this system.
But do you see my point? The point I'm trying to make. So I don't know if you're fully getting it, but the point I'm trying to make is that so first we agree that you would not say the inference is valid. Okay,
Well,
you would
I'm
not
telling
say
you there's
that.
not a consistent answer to that because there's
Yeah,
not
in that scenario.
even in that scenario, I'm giving you different answers. I'm telling you there's not enough dialed in to get a consistent answer because we understand every time you give a hypothetical, it's actually like you've dialed in some specifics, but there's a
No, I
range
understand.
of yeah, okay, right. So I'm saying some of them I would say that, some not, and I'm giving you two cases. So one case where I might not would be I might just specify the system from the outset because I already know what they care about. I know that that's the relevant thing to do. So I might just specify something about some specific system when I talk. Another
In the case where you would, yeah.
yeah, the case where I would might be just to prompt them to clarify the system they're using. So it might be kind of shorthand, like, oh, it's valid. And they might go, yeah, under this logic, not under this one, and this is the one I care about. That's still a person who knows logic and who we agree about what's intuitively valid, but I might be saying it not because it
Okay.
itself should have force, but because it will prompt them to clarify what logic they're using.
Okay, so the word valid in that case you're using to prompt them to clarify which system they're using. The point I'm making is that I take it that just as a general fact, typically the word valid, the point of bringing it up in a context like that, informing somebody that the inference is valid, would be to say that, given that the person accepts the premises and doesn't accept the conclusion, the point of bringing up that word would be to rationally compel them, in other words, to give them a reason to accept the conclusion on those stipulations. But
Yeah,
what you're saying is that you're using the word just to get them to clarify. You're using the word as a kind of like, a trigger of some kind, a trigger word to get them to clarify, if any, like which system they're talking about, even though you both already agree that the inference is not intuitively valid.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's one thing I might do. I also, I mean, I hear you laughing. I'm not sure if you're laughing at that.
No, I'm not. I'm not necessarily laughing. I'm more so.
You could just laugh because it's really different from how you use. Sometimes I'll laugh like, oh, okay, I guess that makes sense.
I'm amused. I'll say that I'm amused. I'm not laughing at you.
Okay, yeah, because I guess it made me wonder, like, do you think I'm doing something stupid or something ridiculous or something that no one could ever have any reasonable basis to do?
I don't think
any of those things are.
I think your behavior and the way that you use language and the context in which you use it is like, let's just say, like vastly different than how I expect other people to, and that's fine if that's what you want to do. But that's kind of that's the cause for the amusement, I think.
Yeah, no, that and that's fine. I understand that. My worry would more be if you think that I'm doing something that there's no reasonable basis to want to do, or that's just like needlessly confusing, or that's I don't know, something like that. But it sounds like you're not saying that. You're just it's far enough.
And by the way, that's not to say that. Sorry to cut you off. That's not that. Yeah, that's not necessarily to say that I don't agree. So you could clarify those words in a number of different ways, but I'm not actually necessarily interested in like making those like further claims. I think I'm more so interested in like just whatever analysis we've already went through, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm just sensitive to things like if someone says straw man or unreasonable, which you clarified those, that's fine. And you clarified this. Or if someone laughs, I'm like, wait, you think I'm doing something silly? And no, I understand. It's just the juxtaposition between your expectation about how the language would be used and how I'm using it is kind of funny, which, yeah, I often laugh similarly.
Okay. So, I mean, what else is there now?
I don't really think there's much. I understand your clarifications about what you said with dialetheism and why that summary is not right. And I can repeat them if you want me to, but I think we were fine on that. And I
Okay.
understand also. I think we each other's semantics and don't
Right.
really see much reason aside from inertia. At least in my case, I don't know if you would agree with that, but I don't really see much reason other than inertia to choose one over the other.
Yeah, I should add, like, what you mean by accepting the logic, accepting the logic, that is not what anybody in the philosophy of logic means by accepting the logic. So I should also add that part. So that is not what anybody else in that domain of philosophy where they kind of like talk about which logics are the quote unquote right or correct ones. That's not what any of them mean.
That I'm not sure if that's the case. That might be the case, but I think that's similar with the moral stuff, and I still feel kind of compelled to use the language like that. Like I don't know how many moral
Yeah.
theorists would say accepting a moral theory is just saying something, making some kind of psychological generalization or prediction about like what kind of situations you'll respond to in which way. But I nonetheless see utility in using it like that.
Well, I mean, that's a bit. So that phrasing is kind of like I mean, because when you say like you'll respond to, wait, isn't the position that accepting a normative theory is just accepting the theory that captures your values? Isn't that what you said earlier?
Yeah, but capturing your values is just it's like a psychological generalization. It's like about how you will react to situations, right? Like to say that I'm a utilitarian is like saying any kind of
No, I
case that I'm
understand. I'm just saying, sorry, I'm just saying because like when you say, so the word react, when you say that, it kind of like implies that like, so it implies that like, it implies seemingly some kind of action to me, which seems weird because like, I could imagine that there is, you know, I could imagine that there is it has nothing to do with any kind of like action. It just has to do with your psychological configuration, which might not result in any action at all.
yeah, I hear that. I don't really know that there's much of a difference. Like I mean, because you're the way you psychologically respond is like kind of an action, right? Like you would be disposed to say it's correct. Your brain would be disposed to fire in a certain way. I don't know.
Yeah, if action is being used in a loose way, that's fine. I suspected it was being used in a bit of a stronger way. Okay,
Yeah, like
yeah,
moving your
so yeah,
arm, or
oh, sorry.
well, by action you mean like something like moving your arm, or like
Yeah,
manipulating your body in some way. Yeah.
yeah. So I guess like the points said before, the idea that no one in the philosophy of logic means what you mean by accepting the logic, so that idea as well. And then you're just saying you're still compelled to use the word that way anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so my response to that is just that I'm not totally sure about how language is being used there, but that could very well be the case. And with moral theories, I think something similar is the case. I don't think most moral theorists would mean what I mean by accepting a normative theory. But
Oh yeah, that's why I went into that. I forgot. So I wanted to make one more point about that. I don't think what you said when it comes to accepting a normative theory, I don't think that's going to be like controversial among people who are, for example, who are kind of like subjectivist-esque. So either they'll say, because presumably like if what the view is just involves the truth makers for normative sentences being the attitudes of agents, then either they'll talk about what broadly reflects the attitudes people tend to have, or they'll be talking about individual people. But I don't think like something like what you said, I see no reason to think like that would be controversial among them. Like, of course, like if people accept different, like if somebody's like a moral realist, they perhaps would not say what you're saying. But if somebody shares the meta ethics, then I don't see why it would be controversial among them.
yeah, I don't think that it would be when I was saying that it's not how most I doubt it's how most moral theorists would use the language. I'm not talking about the subset that are subjectivists. I'm just talking
Okay,
generally. I grant that there's a subset like that, and I suspect that there's also a subset of logicians who would use language similarly. But I mean, I don't.
absolutely not.
Well, I'm not sure that's right, but I don't know.
Okay, and then I think there's one more. Okay, yeah. So there's one more thing, which another. So this is
Have,
related to.
have
Oh, sorry.
you?
Go ahead.
Uh, I'm just wondering, like, if that confidence there is really due. Like, I mean, I don't know. Have you done like you probably haven't done like a comprehensive overview of the kind of like metaphysics of different logicians or something like that. I don't even know how many of them
Um,
are being clear about details like that when they talk about logic. I assume lots of logicians are kind of doing stuff like what mathematicians are doing, where who even knows what exactly their like metaphysics about math or logic are. And if you
um,
prompted them and gave them a bunch of clarification, maybe some of them would converge on a position that's kind of analogous to subjectivism, but with inference.
I don't wait. Well, I don't know where the subjectivism about inference is coming in, but I'm just saying.
I'm just talking about some subset of
Okay,
the. The analogy is just about it being a subset and that subset converging on the language I use. There's no further analogy with subjectivism.
okay. Oh, it's okay. So, I don't understand why you'd call that. Well, okay, that's fine. So,
I just said I
yeah,
think I said analogous to or something like that.
okay, yeah. So, um, yeah. So, have I? So, I guess it depends what you mean by comprehensive overview. I'm like fairly familiar with the philosophy of logic, and I know that when they talk about uh, being accepting that the logic is true or correct or whatever you want to say, or just accepting the logic. I know they're talking about there being some pre-theoretic notion of validity that they're theorizing about, right? And they think certain logics better capture it more so than others. And then certain people object to whether there's a single one. So if you're a logical pluralist, you might think there are multiple equally candidate options for that pre-theoretic notion. And some who are logical monists will deny that. But like I'm familiar enough with the philosophy of logic to know it's like absolutely not like anything close to what you're saying is my point.
I'm not sure if you talk to a bunch of people who do logic or philosophy of logic and spelt out how I mean accept a logic, that they would all just not desire to use language like that. I suspect some amount would be drawn to the kind of distinction that I make, where you can talk about accepting logic, as in being compelled to the conclusions yielded by the logic,
Yeah.
versus accepting that the logic captures pre-theoretic validity. I suspect a lot of people would be friendly to that distinction and wouldn't mind that language.
But
It could
you're
be,
yeah, but you're like so in other words, like I can some there are some additional reasons for saying this. Like one, under your sense of accepting a logic, right? If you accept one logic and somebody accepts a different logic, you know, all you're saying is that they both have dispositions to react in particular ways in accordance. But in philosophy of logic, when they talk about accepting logics and different people accept different logics, they view those as rival theories about the same phenomena, right?
I'm not sure how many are doing what. It's not, it's not literature that I've delved into like you. It could be that, generally speaking, when they use language like accept logic, assuming that language is used a lot, that they're talking about accepting that a logic captures intuitive validity. Or it might be that they're talking about something psychological, or it might be that there's some subset who's talking about something psychological, or it could be that given prompting, some of them would converge on that, and there just hasn't been the same kind of prompting because there haven't been the same kind of debates as there have been in metaethics, etc.
Yeah. Okay. So like I said, I mean, I'd just be repeating what I said earlier, but I'm not even. I don't even find this to be controversial in any way. But there's also like this kind of generalized. So generalized from the previous point I was making. There's like a generalized absurdity in the way you might be want to talk about validity in the sense or sorry accepting the logic I should say in the sense that somebody could believe take a given logic somebody could hold the belief that all of the inferences in the logic not just one of them but all of them they're all not valid they're all not valid in the pre-theoretical sense in other words for all of the inference for each one of the inferences in the for all of the inferences in the consequence relation of the logic. It's not the case that the premises preserve truth to the conclusion. The premises could all be true and the conclusion could be false for all of those inferences. And somebody could believe that about every inference in the consequence relation of the logic and still accept the logic on your view.
Yeah, I guess I don't see any force to that, but I mean, I guess you think that that's like an odd use of language.
So by the way, and By the way, I'm not taking any. I want to make this clear. I'm not taking some burden to like convince you how to use the terms. So that's
Oh, we
clear.
were already. Sorry, and I
Okay.
don't mean to make it seem like that. I
Yeah.
thought we had clarified this, and we can certainly
Okay.
do it again.
Yeah, I
But
just wanted to make that clear because that might have not been clear to people I don't know who's listening. I'm not looking at my phone right now, really.
of
But
course, or maybe
yeah,
I had forgotten it. No, I take it that you are talking about how you use the language, and you're giving some considerations that may or may not motivate. It's like if you run NTT.
right.
Like I listened to your video about NTT. It's like, here's a consideration that motivates me. It might motivate you, but I'm not taking on a burden I'm not. You haven't wrecked me if you respond by just not being motivated by anything I said, because that's not a goal I set for
Yeah.
myself at this time. Yeah.
So I'm just saying I'm just more so interested and people who are compelled to use the word, if they do use the word valid, I care about how they use it and how they might want to use it. And so I think I will throw out a hypothesis here, and I'll hypothesize that most people will find what you said to be absurd. All right, that's the hypothesis. But like that's all. So this is all I have to say about the matter, though. So if you want to add something, you can.
I don't know. I mean, we could poll the people in the room, though they might be biased towards me because it's my server. But you could go like 1s for absurd and 2s for not absurd.
Yeah, I
Either
mean,
kind of
I don't. If somebody wants to do that, I don't care if there's a poll or if somebody wants to. I don't have too much of a concern.
Yeah. Well, if people want to give their impression, that's fine. Because it is of interest to me to know how people see it. So yeah, 1's for absurd, 2 for not absurd. Got 2 1s. Got a 2. My suspicion, again, it's kind of biased towards me in here. So, well, maybe it's not. They like you a lot in here, so maybe it's not. But
wait, I don't even know. I know almost like nobody here. I don't.
Yeah, but they know you. They'll share some of your videos or talk about stuff you say. I think that you have a good reputation in here. But I was just gonna say, my suspicion is just that this is going to be a personality thing, and there's going to be people who are kind of. I suspect you'll just kind of split somewhere. I don't know really what the percentages will be. Yeah, and yeah, just as for most philosophers using the language in a particular way, I do think that's reason to want to use language in that way. It's not motivating for me really, but I guess I have an empirical thing, and you could be totally right about the empirics. I just am not deep in the literature, so I'm not sure if that's the case. And there's also just a thing about like, well, say that you presented this kind of stuff to them, would they see much problem in that usage? Would they themselves have any reasons other than inertia for preferring one usage over the other? Are a lot of them even sensitive to questions like this in the first place, or are they sort of doing something similar to mathematicians? And those all just kind of, I think, sort of undermine the force of saying this is the typical usage of language in the field. At least for me, they do. Okay, I don't know. Do you have anything else, or?
No, sorry, I was reading the comments.
Oh yeah, what do we have? It's well, I don't know if we want to read a bunch of text. You got to just give 1s or 2s. You can't give us whole fucking big text essays. Okay, yeah, but okay, all right. All good.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Okay, all right. Have a good one. Oh, also, I listened to your video about NTT replying to Shadow. I thought that was funny. I like the point that you kept making about about how like if your goal is to help people to not or to help people to interact with this effectively, you're like leading them literally to not do that.
Oh
So
yeah, yeah. That's
I thought that was funny.
yeah. That yeah. I thought that was important to say.
Mhm. Yep. Okay. All right. Okay. I'll talk to you later.
All right, see ya.